Good morning and welcome back to the FloTrack podcast. My name is Lincoln Shrike. He is Kevin Sully. It is Tuesday, October 27th. And for those of you watching at home, on the screen, you can tell I'm wearing way too small of a Spider-Man shirt. It is my son's 5th birthday, and I thought I would honor him by wearing the Spider-Man shirt. And then it is probably going to be either put in the trash or donated because this shirt is way too small. And on the pre-show here, I've been compared to Hulk. Been said I'm wearing a schmedium shirt. All the jokes have been made. I'm sure you'll find a way, Kevin, though, to make some more jokes as we go along here.
If I knew everybody was watching and not everybody is listening, then I would do it more. But I feel like we'd exclude the audio only folks. So I'm not going to say too much more other than the fact that you saw that video recently of The Rock and you said, I want to do that. That's what I want.
That's exactly. This is how he must feel when he wears like an XL, and I'm just wearing a small. I'm hoping this isn't like a kid small. I think it's an adult small, but in any case, it is not the correct size. I like the shirt. I think I might wear the shirt. I feel like it's kind of like Gordon. I mean, Gordon has a bunch of like kid related, maybe not kid related, but like Marvel type shirts. And they fit him maybe in 2008 and not as much anymore, but he still rocks them. And I admire him for that. I have kind of stopped doing that other than this one last shirt I have of Spider-Man that, fit a long time ago.
It's interesting. I have a son that's your age too, and I never thought that me wearing an excessively small shirt would be part of something he would want for my birthday. But every kid is different. So happy 5th there to Knox. Also, before we get going, I wanted to clean up one item. Gordon mentioned the last time he and I were on the pod on Friday that he thought South Dakota State was suspending track and cross country. Not true. We heard from South Dakota State. Got an email from them. They are alive and well. Apologies to them. So Gordon maybe should be a little more cautious before he's like, the following programs have been cut, or maybe possibly, I don't know. So South Dakota State. Isn't our own Alex Lohr a South Dakota State alum? I believe he is. So I believe we would have known
with him first. Yeah, we should have maybe checked with him first. These days it feels like you could throw out almost any mid-level, mid-major program and say, they're on the chopping block, and you've got about a 10% chance of being right. So maybe that's what he was shooting for there. I know Gordon's really enjoyed putting on his reporter's cap these last few months because he just texts coaches in his free time, which, I mean, good on him, but that's not something I choose to spend my time on. But so maybe he just got a little into himself, a little cocky there, and thought he would go for a Woj bomb, and it didn't. It backfired. So too bad.
Turns out you got to be right. That's the problem with those things.
You got to be right.
You got to be right. Your hitting percentage has to be close to 100. Another thing, speaking of reaching out to coaches, we're getting a lot of emails, people asking about D2 and D3. Is it going to happen this year, and to what extent? So I think you, being the D2, D3 guy, do need to put your shirt in the laundry, run it in the dryer a couple times, make sure it's even smaller, get on your phone, call your contacts to figure out everything we need to know about D2 and D3, because we're a podcast that responds to the people out there and they want some D2, D3 knowledge.
Yeah. I know it's been quiet in the D2 and D3 forests for these last few months. I know that D1 has managed to have a few meets. I assume that there's some small competitions going. I don't know if they're sponsored. I don't know if the Oklahoma State level on D2 is happening. I mean, I know the NCAA shut down basically everybody, and clearly their football is not anywhere near the level of the FBS or whatever it's called. I forget. So there's not the incentive there for D1 to have its sports. So I think it's kind of been a ghost town. I know on our site we're going to have a conference meet at some point. Let me look when that is. The old Gulf South. Yes, that's coming up this weekend. So there is some action.
What division is that?
Huh?
What division is that? Just for those of us who aren't.
Oh yes, sorry,
that's in D2 and D3. We're not all experts here.
That's D2. Yep, that's D2. It includes Lee out of Tennessee. They've had some good. They've had some people. I can look a little bit further as we go along.
I got Huntsville in that one as well too, right?
That's Division 2. And I think the meet is in Birmingham, if I'm not mistaken. We've got University of Alabama and Huntsville, Delta State, Lee, University of Valle, Shorter University. I mean, just your Gulf South schools in Division 2. Who could forget? So anyways, that'll be on FloTrack this weekend. Get excited, everyone. Mm-hmm. That's going to be on Halloween. So if you're into spooky cross country, if you've been missing it, I don't think they're going to be running in costumes, but at least there'll be some D2 cross country for those of you missing it at home.
Yeah. Well, and if anybody has any other more detailed questions, remember the email address, flotrackpodcast@gmail.com, specifically about D2, D3, or shirt sizing. Lincoln can respond to you on the pod.
I don't know if I'm qualified anymore to talk about Shane. I think my credibility is lost.
Never. Your credibility was gained. Never. The bold action that you took to put on that shirt. You made a decision when you put on that shirt, Lincoln. You said, you know what? I'm going to choose to show my biceps and part of my lower shoulder today. And I commend that.
Yep. I even set this shirt out last night. I knew I was going to be wearing it. I was amped. I was ready to go for today's show. Yesterday, quite hilariously, when news breaks, when Gordon and I are doing a podcast, things are going to get fun. But Gordon was doing a diatribe of some variety of who knows what, and I clicked on Twitter and saw the Taoufik Makhloufi news, a bag containing various paraphernalia, although has not been indicated whether or not there were actual performance-enhancing drugs in the bag. But in any case, a bag supposedly belonging to Taoufik Makhloufi found in a training center in France with needles and, like I said, various paraphernalia. Is clearly not a good look for the former Olympic champion and a guy who how would you go about this? Do you say there's been questions about him in the past? Because you could say that about almost anyone, right? The suspicion is higher about Makhloufi just in the way he arrived at the Olympic Games in 2012, kind of out of nowhere, and really dominated that final. And in the years since, although he's consistently been good at the championships, and typically we say, consistency is a positive thing, is a good thing when it's regarding to suspicion, because it shows, I don't know, that you weren't just a one-hit wonder that was pumping yourself full of performance-enhancing drugs. However, this is a long sentence here. Stick with me. However, he tends to only show up basically for the championship, so the suspicion has been there. It would seem higher than it is for most athletes. So with all that said, what was your reaction to the Makhloufi news yesterday?
I am cautious with these things because they've happened numerous times, and we've even had situations where suspensions have been announced. Pretty recently, we've had a situation that ended up with a guy knocking on a door next to a gas canister. So I don't want to get too far ahead. I know that there's an incentive to be the first person, and you guys were probably literally the first people because you were refreshing Twitter that day, to say what it means. Now that we've had a little bit of time, I think a couple things are clear, and this is where people get ahead of themselves a little bit. It's not going to impact any medals, even if there was drugs found in these possession, because this is not a positive test from 2012 or 2016 or major championship. For that to happen, they would need to retest an old sample and find something. It may not even impact him going forward, because if it
they have,
as they're reporting.
I was just going to say, they have retested because of Russia's chicanery. The London sample has been retested. I don't, for what that's worth.
Right. But 16, 17, 18, 19 on, right? Yeah. There's still obviously a chance for that, because we saw him last year at the World Championships as well, too. And it may not even impact anything in terms of a suspension right now, because as you mentioned before, there's no evidence right now that the actual PEDs are in there. All it does is add more suspicion to what most people already regarded as a suspicious guy. So from that perspective, I think you just wait and you see, maybe more information will come about. But as you described before, trying to kind of pinpoint, well, why does he get so much scrutiny? There's been other people who have showed up a bit out of nowhere and succeeded, but a lot of those people have gotten popped. I'm thinking of in that 2012 Olympics, of course, of the Turkish women, and you're like, wait a minute, I've never heard of these people, and then now they're like crushing it with sub 4 1500 meter performances and closing really hard. The difference with Makhloufi, with the people who don't get scrutiny, is the attention seemed to bubble up enough to a point where media members, journalists, and athletes felt comfortable speaking about it for whatever reason. And maybe it's the connection to who his coach was, or maybe it was just all the circumstances combined. But there's a difference between rumors and rumbling that never really makes it out of like the dark corners of the track internet, or people telling you things on the side that don't get backed up, to where people are saying things. They're still not saying it out now. They're not saying he is doping. What they're saying is, man, that was pretty suspect performance, or that was suspicious, or that'll raise a lot of eyebrows. And it's reached that level with him, and it had been there for a while, which is different than a lot of other athletes. But I just don't know what it changes in terms of concrete proof. I mean, you remember there was a big drug bust in Spain not too long ago with several high profile athletes that hasn't led to much in the way of charges that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Right. And this seems much less significant, and the burden of proof much, much higher when you're talking about actual performance enhancing drugs were found in that situation. We don't know if they were here. Yeah, I'm trying to like find the word. It's always difficult because it feels like a lot of times the suspicion has a layer of xenophobia associated with it that's quite disgusting. So it's trying to look at one person and look at them objectively, while also noting that you could say by some people's analysis of them could be clouded by the fact that, well, they don't run at the pre-classic every year. They don't run, it's tough in track and field, right? You want to be equal. You want to look at an American athlete the same way you look at an Algerian, the same way you look at as a South African. And a lot of times on Twitter, that's not the way it goes. Now, in this case, obviously, if any athlete, you found a bag of needles that supposedly belongs to an athlete, it doesn't matter who they are, they're going to be criticized. And obviously with him, the murmurs were there in 2012. I do want to say, you look through his Tils Tapaja page. I mean, he was around in 2010, around in 2011. He wasn't anywhere next to that level in 2012.
Yeah.
But this isn't like the Turkish women situation like you cited. All of this may be a moot point, however, if there was a bag of injectables of which they can prove that there were performance-enhancing drugs going into his body. Now, what you said is correct. We're a long way from Makhloufi not being able to compete, and we're certainly galaxies away from any thought that he could have medals removed. I think we know that really only happens when your sample comes back from a specific event. Does that actually tend to happen? He has his reputation, if it wasn't already pretty shaky, has taken a massive blow. And there's a good chance, though, that that's the worst thing that happens to him here, because I don't know the structure of the jurisdiction here. Like, does World Athletics open their own investigation? Do they allow the French authority? Because the French authorities seemingly, they're operating a criminal investigation, which is different than what World Athletics would be doing. Correct? I mean, there's just a lot of complicating factors here that I don't know if the main focus is going to be keeping Taoufik Makhloufi off the track. I think the burden of proof is going to be incredibly high if he doesn't test positive that he's taking drugs. I just think that's going to be incredibly high. I know I brought up a ton of points there, but it's just all the thoughts kind of floating around my head associated with this. the way we react to these cases and ultimately what comes of them when you see it, because you think, oh, we caught them in their hand in the cookie jar, it's over. That's not the way it works out normally.
I'll take all your points one by one.
Yeah.
Actually, 1 through 27. I'll count down 27 to 1. I think you're right about the jurisdictions being all mixed up and complicated and hard to sort out. He's an Algerian guy who was training in France. The governing body, World Athletics, is based in Monaco and operates all around the world. And there's different competitions everywhere. And it just gets very convoluted. I'm guessing AIU will open an investigation into this. But again, it's not against the rules to just have syringes, as far as I know, right?
Right.
There needs to be actual PEDs in there. So again, you can see the path to where this really doesn't change anything. It just adds another layer of suspicion. To your point before about would we be saying this about an American athlete? And I think the one thing to remember here is just context, because we just know more about American athletes. So if someone has a big breakthrough or a big jump up, you could say, well, they did that because X, Y, and Z happened. They changed coaches. They switched events. They finally got in a good opportunity to run. We don't often always see that with other athletes because we are just not covering them. They don't have as much attention on them. Now, again, I'm not saying this is specific about Makhloufi. I'm just talking about in general. Also, with American athletes, just the reasons for why they would compete, where they would compete, are much more linear. Hey, we're going to expect to see them here, 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 and here, and then they'll end up here. International athletes, you don't always know that. Some of them only compete for a long time in their home country, and then they go to a Diamond League competition. Some of them compete everywhere, all across the globe, and some of them have more reserved schedules. And we don't really know what's going on in their home country or about their coaching situation or their health. Again, it's just lacking that context. So sometimes these out of nowhere performances seem more out of nowhere because we are not on their beat all the time like we are with American athletes. 100%. Again, this is not to say that Makhloufi's performance wasn't stunning and shocking, but I think it does. You get this whole like mysterious person vibe with them, when you could probably say the same thing about some American athletes who burst on the scene if you were a foreign track and field fan. If you were in this other country, it's like, well, wait, where'd this person come from? They were just in college and now all of a sudden they're winning a championship or a Diamond League. That's crazy. One other point, and what doesn't help, and I saw this in an article that was brought up, it's just people feel the need to just kind of throw everything when one thing is enough. And one of the things Makhloufi was criticized for in 2012, I don't know if you remember this, was he ran the first heat of the 800 and then drop out. Yeah, almost got DQ'd. Okay, the reason he almost got DQ'd was because there's a stupid rule. This is an idiotic rule that should be not even used really in high school or college, but I get it because it's an honest effort rule because you don't want to impact field size and you don't want to impact team scoring. But at the Olympics, you should be able to pick and choose and drop out of events whenever you want. It does not make any sense to hold a person responsible for competing all the way through the rounds. So what happened was he ran a round in the 800, but decided not to run the next round of the 800. Why? Because he didn't want to get tired before the 1500 meter final. So instead, they made him come up with this bogus medical excuse about how he was sick before, which it was bogus, but the rule is bogus too. So it added this extra layer in 2012 of people being, oh, this guy is suspect and shady, and what's the federation doing? You could make that argument, but it should be completely separate from the 800, 1500 honest effort debacle that went on. I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that that rule is completely idiotic and should be scrapped. But I needed to mention it. 100%.
Yeah, and I remember that as well. And it came up for me. It came up after he won the 1500. It like became like a mini controversy. It was controversy B after controversy A was who was Taoufik Makhloufi? What business does he have dominating the Olympic final? I remember seeing highlights because that 800 heat was during the day. I remember seeing highlights of him like peeling off the track or whatever.
He dropped out, yeah. I was just saying he jogged it, but he actually dropped out, right?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe that's what happened. But yeah, that I guess that serves to the larger point of there are some unfair criticisms that I think would not be if we saw him more frequently, if we heard from him more often, and if he got the same level of coverage as Americans. I think there are some unfair things that are waged against Makhloufi that shouldn't necessarily be put against him simply on the fact that he's Algerian and he doesn't compete as much as some people want him to. But if you look back throughout the years, he was competing. He competed at a Diamond League in 2008 and finished a place, or excuse me, in 2010 and finished a place behind Bernard Lagat. So there are some performances that give him a consistent track record. That is separate though from this. Anyone with the bag of needles syringes is not a good look. But like you said, there needs to be proof that there was performance enhancing drugs in there for him to be suspended. And without news coming out that's the case, then all this is just a PR crisis for Makhloufi. Well, Makhloufi has weathered PR crises before. So if there's no drugs, I think he's in South Africa saying, that's okay. You'll see me in Tokyo in 2021. I'll be there, and you won't see me probably before then, but at least on the international stage. Because I don't you feel like if there was EPO in there, if there was steroids in there, that would have made its way into the news media, right? I mean that's where I kind of sit.
Yeah, but you don't know what else is coming, or how they got this information from whom, and maybe that person who was able to discovered other things as well. I don't think the story is over by any means, and I'm approaching this just from a purely, is he going to be running and what's it mean to his previous accomplishments perspective. That's where I'm sitting at it from, because it is obviously there's suspicion, but there was already suspicion. And I'm sure people are shaking their heads saying, whoa, come on, you got to kick him out. You got to get rid of him. But we can't really walk down. I don't think you can build a sport and an anti-doping policy around that. I mean, I'm assuming he's been tested as frequently as possible. And there needs to be rules, and we need to follow it. Are people going to get through the cracks? Yeah, obviously. But the flip side of that is a very dangerous precedent that we set up, where anybody under suspicion, like you can't have a professional sport where anybody under suspicion is going to be booted. Like that, just it's a non-tenable, non-functioning entity at that point. Where people get suspicious, I think, from 2011 to 2012, drops 2.5 seconds in the 800. Drops 4 seconds in the 1500, and then they're like, okay, wow, it came out of nowhere. Again, other people have made those drops, but we just, we didn't have the context of what Makhloufi was doing, and then obviously doesn't help himself in the future when he goes dark for months at a time and then just shows up. And you and I were in Doha. Like we weren't the only ones who had these concerns or these questions, right? When he showed up in Doha, weren't there a lot of people from all over the world in that media area asking, where are you? That wasn't just a Lincoln Shrike screaming a question from the back of the room because he's had 12 coffees, like Will Ferrell, and kicking and screaming. And he's just like, what do you say to the kids? Like it wasn't that. Like people were trying to get answers from him, and he was he evasive? Was he, I don't know the best way to describe it because I wasn't doing the interview. I just watched it afterwards. I mean, he didn't speak. English is not his. It's not even his second language, right? He speaks French, but didn't you get a translator? Did you request a translator for that one? I think you requested a translator for that one.
Maybe that was Kajelka. I don't. It's tough to remember. He was pleasantly evasive. He definitely was. I mean, he was happy. He
said Hakuna Matata.
He did say Hakuna Matata, which broke the ice and definitely disarmed a lot of us steely veteran journalists. He
answer the question into my mic.
Yeah, he. I mean, he was in a good mood after that, and obviously, that wasn't necessarily going to just give a full spiel on Jama Aiden and their relationship in the past, and what, where he's been, and why he just pops up and how he does so well. Whether it was English not as a first or second language issue or not, he doesn't have to necessarily answer those questions. He only has to answer to World Athletics, and this may be the time where he really has to finally, answer some serious questions. I think, though, I'm gonna, if a case is brought against him, I'll be curious to see what his his appeal is.
Evidence,
not appeal,
right?
But what's his excuse, and what's, I mean, if you do have to believe that he was dumb enough or bold enough to leave a bag of needles if we think it belongs to him in his locker or around this place in France.
I don't know. People do dumb stuff all the time.
Yeah, people do dumb stuff. I know that's one thing. And then two, I don't know. I mean, you can't completely discount the possibility that someone's tried to set him up. I mean, maybe not, but I want to know, were there any drugs in there? What are the documents belonging to him? Is it a Starbucks gift card with his name on it, or is it his passport? Like, what is it? There's a lot more come out on this.
I like conspiracy Lincoln here about someone set him up. The fact that someone would care enough to set up Taoufik Makhloufi is pretty interesting. I mean, how many people know who he is? How many people know who he is? I mean, you could probably
maybe he's been hogging the treadmills at the training center. I don't know. And somebody got mad.
Look.
A bag full of syringes. Who keeps a bag full? How many syringes do you need?
People do dumb stuff all the time, who are committing crimes, and oftentimes the defense is, there's no way they could be that dumb, and oftentimes no, they slipped up, they made a mistake. I'm not saying it what it indicates, but Occam's razor here would point in one direction. Again, my thinking is, what really matters is not the court of public opinion, because in many ways he's already been tried in the court of a public opinion.
Oh, yeah,
what matters now is the actual court, or the AIU. Is there anything here that they can work with in order to suspend him? And from what I've read so far, the answer is no. But just again, like you and Gordon were talking about smoke and fire, and Gordon did a really great breakdown of how much smoke leads to fire and what fire does. And he sets fire to the rain and he watches it burn. And it was incredible. It does not, in terms of whether or not he's allowed to run or not, it doesn't matter. And people are going to roll their eyes, but people have been rolling their eyes for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
So what's the difference?
I was playing devil's advocate to some extent. Well, obviously.
Here's the thing, though. Let's just put this in the perspective of you. If someone found a bag in a locker room with your passport in it and the shirt that you're currently wearing, I would go out on a limb and say there's no way Lincoln would have that shirt, because that's way too small. But today, you proved me completely wrong because you did it. So we don't know. That's what I'm saying. There's a lot of mystery here.
Yeah. Yeah. On a serious note, this confirms what a lot of people thought. I think of, doesn't confirm, but some people are obviously have their beliefs confirmed when they heard this news about Makhloufi. So some people have already labeled him a doper even before there was any shred of evidence that he could have been involved in some malfeasance. Now they have it and they'll say that, but that is different than him being actually, suspended and convicted doping cheat. Well, long way to go, it feels like there.
Right. Yeah. You have the progression, you have the infrequent competition, and then you have the association with the coach. There's three things. And then now you have the syringes. Okay. But you have four pieces of evidence that point in a direction, but there's not one among those that by itself leads to a suspension or certainty. You have four things you could introduce to make a circumstantial case, but if you're trying to get him suspended, you'd trade all that for just one guarantee. But someone would say, hey, in today's current climate, you're never going to get that one because smart people are always going to be figuring out a way to stay ahead of this stuff. So you have to push it under that, like through that method, through that realm.
Yeah.
But anyway.
We shall see. That was a lightning bolt of news in a desert of track and field things. We did have another bit of news yesterday, and it really seemed not fitting. Fitting's not the right word, but I've been watching the Oscar Pistorius documentary, which is 6 hours long, 4 parts, 6 hours long. I've been watching the Oscar Pistorius documentary, and so hearing about Blake Leeper's ruling felt appropriate, just simply because they covered Oscar Pistorius's Kaz case in that documentary, and Pistorius's ruling was cited in Leeper's case. However, the result's completely different. Pistorius won his case way back in 2008, I believe, and yesterday Blake Leeper once again his appeal has been denied. He is the American 400-meter runner. Last year, he made the U.S. final. He has been running on blades, if you will, that World Athletics say are too long for someone of his height, and Kaz agreed with them, and he will not be allowed to compete in the able-bodied competitions with the current prosthetics that he uses. Kevin, we got to see him front and center last year in Des Moines, and seemed like there was going to be some chance he made the team. He ended up getting 5th, but he certainly would have been in the relay pool. But of course, he was denied the permission, I guess, to compete in Doha. But another setback from him, and really the case is, he says, I've been on these prosthetics for too long, or for my entire career. I'm not going to change. And World Athletics says they're simply too long. Their argument was the length of them is for someone with a torso that would be equivalent to a 6'8" person. He's has a torso the size of 5'9". Back and forth with his lawyers and whatnot. But again, ultimately Kaz denied it, and we won't see Blake Leeper in an able-bodied competition anytime soon.
Yeah. And I wonder how much more back and forth there'll be from the legal perspective. I'm surprised it took this long. I'm guessing they would have gone faster if he had made the team, or they had, I guess you're right. He could have gone on the relay pool, but if he had beaten beaten Michael Norman and Fred Curley, maybe there would have been a quicker decision. But you're right. Out of nowhere, after those opening rounds, it was a real possibility, and everybody was scrambling to figure out the situation and what the rule would be. I thought it was interesting that they did that comparison of a 6'8" person versus a 5'9" person, and that's the line. That's the line that they're drawing. So, I mean, could they now just come up with a rule and say, all right, you're allowed to compete in the able-bodied competition if your blades are X% of your total height, and then create a range? Because I feel like, and this is a different situation than Semenya. So I want to make that clear right now. I'm not saying that they're the exact same thing or even close to the same thing, but I do want to bring up this idea of setting a marker, creating precedent, and then having to go back on it later. Right? So for the DSD athletes, we've talked about it. It's 400 to a mile where they're banned. But you and I and a lot of smart people, I mean, you and I aren't the smart people, you and I plus a lot of other smart people, in contrast to us, have said, well, what's going to happen when there's somebody in the 200 who's DSD, or somebody in the steeple who's DSD? Well, they'll probably move it. So I'm interested, if they do come out with a hard and fast rule, are they going to eventually have to go back on it? Is it possible to do that? Because it seems like they are hesitant to outright ban it and say, no, if you have prostheses, you compete in the Paralympics, and that's where you can compete on the international level. If your national governing body wants to let you compete, that's fine. They can let you compete, but we want to make sure that it stays in the Paralympic competition. They're not doing that, right? They're not doing that. They're making the argument that's very narrow, that's saying in this specific case, the blades are not fair. And I wonder if that's sustainable.
Yeah. This is such an interesting thing because it is so counterintuitive. It feels like in a vacuum. You look at it and you say someone without legs is advantaged against people with legs. A couple interesting things I want to point out. When Pistorius won his case, a lot of World Athletics argument against him was obviously there was scientific, physics things associated with it, but a lot of it was he gets faster over the second half than he runs the first half. Well, that was a losing argument. So they've really focused here with Leeper on the length of his blades, which are in fact longer than Pistorius, much longer than Pistorius's. And in fact, I believe Pistorius has said in the past, obviously other events transpire with him, but has said in the past that he did not think that Leeper's prosthetics were fair. So that's an interesting factor. Another interesting thing, and what was brought up by his defense team, and I should say his defense team headed by the same lawyer who brought Pistorius's case, and the same lawyer who brought Semenya's case. So they really obviously went for the A squad here with somebody who's familiar, appealing to Kaz. His defense team argued that their studies showing that specific body types and what one torso length should mean for the length of legs, it did not include any African athletes or any black athletes, which was a significant part of his case. Now, Kaz obviously didn't go with that, but it is an interesting factor. And in fact, they went so far as to claim discrimination because their study, World Athletics study, did not include any African athletes. And they were citing that there's indications physiologically where there could be differences, and that could prove that he's not getting this unfair advantage with these longer legs than what were approved with Pistorius. So that's an interesting angle. I'm going to be interested to read kind of the full report here. But it's not on itself. It comes off as, wait, Pistorius was allowed to compete. Why is Leeper? Well, there are significant differences with the length of his blades compared to Pistorius, like I said. And it's been interesting because track and field feels like this sport that we like to pride ourselves on inclusion. And although this isn't going to get a massive amount of attention worldwide, the biggest thing, track and field is kind of, whether you believe this is right or not, they may be a more gatekeepy than perhaps any other sport. When you talk about getting Semenya out, fighting against athletes, that are disabled, regardless of if it's right that Leeper be allowed to compete against able-bodied athletes, it's interesting that they are so focused on not having someone like him on an international stage. You feel like it could be, and maybe it's unfair, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about that, but they are so focused on not having him here. It seems like it's they're losing something by not allowing him to compete.
I see it a little differently. I see track as being at the front lines of every single issue that affects sport in the world. And part of that's because it spans the entire world. It's an individual sport, so that way you can quantify performances much easier. And its disciplines involve athletes of all different body types. And that's why you see things like DSD athletes. You see the issues that we're talking about with athletes with prosthetic limbs, issues around doping, right? Like track takes on all this stuff, even issues like we were talking about last week that are of a lighter nature, talking about pacing and shoes and all this other stuff. It all funnels into track, and you could say, man, it just gives them a negative, no-win situation after no-win situation. But I think what we're going to see is in the next 10 to 20 years, a lot of other sports are going to be grappling with these issues. And track has just been the first one that's done it and done it publicly. And maybe people will look at track and say, hey, track did it completely wrong. We're going to avoid that. Or maybe people are going to use track as a blueprint moving forward. But you just don't see these same issues of inclusion come up as frequently in other sports. They do to a little bit, but not to the amount that track and field does. And I think that's one thing I like admire about track, or at least can empathize with track, is just like it's everybody. And that's why we probably like track in the beginning with it. It's everybody. And that means it's everybody and trying to figure out how to make everybody happy and try to figure out how to make sure that there's a level playing field for the greatest amount of people involved.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't necessarily associate that. Yeah, there's a chance, there may be a double amputee that one day wants to, I don't know, play in the NBA. I mean, that obviously would be different blades. I mean, and that's much different. Moving laterally would be a challenge. But you're right. Track is at the forefront because running's so pure, and it, obviously with the technology, it's accessible for amputees.
I mean, just like a doping, right? Just like a doping. How many sports actually want to get rid of doping, honestly, and put in a robust plan for doping? I mean, it's certainly not a lot of the major team sports in the United States. You can say, okay, it's the Olympic sports are really leading the way. Well, how many Olympic sports have the challenges that track has in terms of the amount of athletes and the geographical diversity from the this is not swimming where it's a few countries that dominate, but that there's entire huge swaths of the population that don't participate. Everybody has a track and field athlete. Every single country has at least one track and field athletes, and many of them have elite track and field athletes. So I just think track is because it's a victim of its own success and its own popularity in many ways, that it has to deal with the issues of the world because it is a sport of the world. Man, Seb Coe should use that as his World Athletics tagline. I feel like I just did like a commercial there, of the world or something.
Yeah.
Just put the theme song behind it.
Maybe. Earth sports.
I mean it in a complimentary way, but it's also you could also track that back to where all the problems were. Like, think of it this way. Think about how many people, don't even think about it from an athlete perspective. Think about it from like a bureaucratic perspective. Think about how many governing bodies there are in the world with all these different countries and how many entities and agencies there are. And we hear a lot about people who do bad things in those positions, but just the sheer number of them tells us that, you're going to find some bad apples out there who are covering up doping positives, taking bribes, screwing around with the money, what have you. In other sports, there's just not that level of participation to where it brings in that amount of people. So it's just, it's something that's just like always going to be with the sport. And in most cases, it almost serves as an anchor.
Yeah. Yep. And, in other sports, in all the markets in the NBA, the teams are given equal access to facilities and all that. And that's not it's not the same. And for the most part, we're dealing with similarly rich athletes, and that's not the case here. And the GMs are paid on a close to equal, playing field. And that's not going to be the same across different continents in track and field. It's just, so the incentives are there to have some bad apples, if you will. But yeah, this is I don't know how we got down this path, but Blake Leeper is going to, I suppose, continue to fight this, and is really, he has shown in the past does not want to try to change the length of his prosthetics, which I think is interesting. And it does say, and he said in the past, I've been running on these forever. I shouldn't have to do that, and I'd have to basically relearn how to run. Is that really what he's 31 now? Is he really going to miss his chance to ever compete in like an Olympic, maybe, an Olympics is a stretch, but a international meeting simply because he doesn't want to change the length of his blades? We'll see. Because Oscar Pistorius figured it out, and it feels like, well, Blake, why don't you just do that? I know it's more complicated than that, but
it was a little, if I'm remembering if I'm remembering this correctly, it was a little bit different for Pistorius. And I remember talking to someone who was pretty high up and knowledgeable about the world of track and field. I think the thought process there was, hey, this is a good story. Now, this is early on with Pistorius, obviously. This is a good story. Let this guy run. And I don't think they ever thought he was going to be as fast as he got to be. And then once he got that fast, then it was like, oh man, now we have an issue on our hands, because this isn't just a feel good story. This is someone who's going to impact the competition. What do we do?
Well, and to be clear, though, I mean, he was initially denied from competing, and then he won his CAS case in whatever it was, 2008. And it's not like there wasn't resistance against him back in the day too.
But there were not. You didn't have like meets banning him and things like that, like you did with Semenya. I think because they thought it was going to be a innocent story. But then, and what did he make? Semis was as far as he got in London, and I think people were fine with that. But imagine what would have happened if he would have made the final and been able to contend for a medal. I don't think that they were. I don't think they thought it all through. They thought short term from a public relations perspective, and so since they had that experience, I think that definitely impacted how they were going to deal with Leeper.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it's interesting, and you feel bad for him on one level, but I think the writing's been on the wall with, his refusal to change his prosthetics length. I think that we always knew that this was going to be the outcome. This kind of was a blip on the radar yesterday. This just popped up. There seems to be really nowhere to turn for him to compete other than to change the length of his prosthetics, and it doesn't seem like that's happening anytime soon. A nice guy, very jovial in the mix zone, and it would be cool to see him out there, but a long way to go until something like that happens, it seems like, after yesterday's ruling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of heavy news on today's show.
Yeah. And a Spider-Man shirt. All right. Way too small Spider-Man shirt. Okay. That'll do it for us. For Kevin, I'm Lincoln. You can email the show, FloTrackPodcast@gmail.com. We will see you back here tomorrow.